I started off the day with the mad ramblings of somebody who is suffering from insomnia putting out a build guide that I don't quite understand how to optimize. I ended off my day by spending multiple hours testing Prey on the Weak in vulnerable status on this test dummy. The conclusions, Prey on the Weak absolutely works, no question, except it also doesn't. And it's probably something much more sinister at play. Now, for this to make sense, you have to understand the fact that a lot of people have been reporting that Prey on the Weak hasn't been working. In fact, about 2 weeks ago, I got pinged by Woody saying like, hey, Prey on the Weak doesn't seem to be working. Can anybody else test this? And when I initially went back and tested it, I found that it absolutely worked. I got my expected 1.16 damage multiplier if I applied Vulnerable to a target. The Necromancer can apply Vulnerable very simply. You can just cast Corpse Tendrils and boom, the monster is vulnerable. And all of a sudden I'm doing 3,400 damage, whereas if I don't have Vulnerable applied to the target and I go and Decompose, I'm only doing about 2,500 damage. Pretty open and closed case there as far as I'm concerned. Now here's the problem. Other people didn't get this result. You may have seen Moxie's video recently where he wasn't getting this result. In fact, Rax went and tested it as well, both of them on the Druid, and also found that Prey on the Weak was not actually acting as a damage multiplier. With the conclusion, since both of them showed roughly like a 1% damage increase and sometimes not even a damage increase at all, that it must be additive and it's basically getting lost in the very large amount of total additive damage that your character can have at any given point. But here's the problem. I know I'm not wrong, and they also know they're not wrong. How do I know that? Well, we talked about it a lot, shared our data, went back and retested multiple times, and here was at least the barest minimum of what I could say confidently. It definitely works on the Necromancer, so let me show you the data set and explain how I got to that conclusion a few days back. So because enough people were asking me, hey, did you see Moxie's video? Hey, have you looked at Prey on the Weak? And I was like, this was an open and closed case. What are people talking about? I eventually went and investigated, but I wanted to put out this data because I have empirical proof that it absolutely works. Now, given a big enough data set, my confidence interval would get stronger and stronger. You'd be able to see it very clearly, but the preliminary results are pretty easy to understand. I went through, I got a data set of 30 attacks. I was using Bone Splinters, so it's very easy to rack up a bunch of attacks. No overpowers, no crits, just looking at the base damage. Then the base damage after applying Vulnerable via Corpse Tendrils. Then the base damage with Prey on the Weak. And then thinking that there might be some weird interactions with the vampire powers, I also applied Vulnerable via Metamorphosis. And what that basically pulled out is this set of data. Just as a quick reference, this is all of my additive damage, just so you can understand why it probably wasn't just additive damage being misunderstood as a multiplier, because at low enough damage numbers, if you have no other stats, additive damage effectively works as a multiplier. If all you have is base vulnerable and all you have is 16 additive vulnerable damage, that second bucket of damage would work as a multiplier, just so you understand the base concept. But looking at all of the damage that I had 65 all damage, I had damage versus close, so we're already at 100 additive damage. I had damage versus healthy, so 87.5 additional, so that's 187.5 additive damage. So adding on 16 additive damage here would only get me an 8% damage increase. But just to show you, here are the average damages. So 210 average damage, and then 264 with Vuln, 283 with Vulnerable with Prey on the Weak, and then 275 as an average when I applied it with Metamorphosis. Now, Metamorphosis should not change how much vulnerable damage I'm doing, and this is probably just noise based off of the data set and the low end value that I had for my data set. It turns out that 30 attacks really isn't that much to be able to draw like really strong statistical analysis from, but it's good enough to paint a picture. So if you want to look at it, our min damage across these data sets, you'll notice that my min damage with Vuln and Prey on the Weak was actually lower than my min damage with Vuln. Again, some noise from the lack of volume in the test set. That's why we also want to look at max damage, seeing that our highest max damage outperformed our highest max damage from the previous set. And we also want to look at median, because just getting the average doesn't necessarily tell you how valuable each individual piece of data in your dataset really is, but by comparing the median against the average, what we can see is that our average damage is not that far removed, or is only a couple percentages away from our median damage. That means that our data set probably has a pretty good distribution throughout it. Now, that's as far as like my ability to do statistical analysis goes. You can do confidence intervals, you can get a bit p-value. I could throw this all into like a chart. I just don't know how to do all of that. I'm not going to pretend to like I do. But basically what my findings are, just very quickly if you look at it, is that the difference between my damage without vulnerable and my damage with vulnerable was about 22%. That's exactly what we expected. It should be a 1.2 times multiplier, or a 20% increase. On top of that, our damage with prey was an 11% damage increase. You might go, well, wait a minute, if it's not a 16% damage increase, doesn't that mean that it must be doing something other than a multiplier? Well, just remember that based off of our end, based off our small data set here, our vulnerable damage outperformed the expectation here. So the difference between this number and this number is weighted closer to the vulnerable damage as opposed to damage with the prey. So if I were to literally take this 2.6% increase here and move it over to here, all of a sudden we're at like 13.7% increased damage. So it's like, okay, that's probably being a multiplier. And again, for me, open and closed case, it's obviously a multiplier. Even if it were additive, it's like vastly overperforming whatever additive damage bonus it should be giving, almost to the point like it's a multiplier. So to me, done. I'm positive that this is working as intended because it corroborated the findings that I had 2 weeks ago when I tested this the first time that Woody reached out. But here's the problem. Moxie did his tests and he didn't show a damage increase. Rax did his tests and he didn't show the damage increase. In fact, this has been a hot topic for barbarians, rogues, druids across a multitude of the various like publicly facing discords. So many people are saying that it's additive. It's obviously additive and writing it off completely. How is it possible that I'm getting a different result? It turns out that Echo Hack went and tested it also on the Necromancer and also showed the 16% damage increase that you would expect. How is it possible that we're getting different results? Well, either I'm bad at this game and maybe a bunch of other people are also bad at this game. And while most people don't really understand like pure statistical analysis, you can at least see when big number go up from a multiplier. So something else must be at play here. And assuming that I was wrong, assuming that I had messed something up, because there's no way that so many other intelligent people were just like completely off their rocker, I went and tested it again. This time we used Decompose. Why are we using Decompose here? Well, it is very clear to see the damage number of Decompose because it is consistent once you are channeling it. And I wanted to really do my due diligence here. I wanted to remove all of the noise from the previous data sets. So rather than do 10, 20, 30 hits, I did 50. Do you know how long it takes to channel Decompose 50 times, waiting for the cooldown of corpse tendrils to go away and to make sure that all lingering, hard to control variable damage states have also gone away? The answer is a couple hours and it sucks. I have video recording, which I was gonna like show to prove it, but it's just me standing there decomposing a whole bunch. Let's just go ahead and look at the results though, because it was very, very interesting. I looked at base damage, damage with vuln, and damage with prey on the week. So for our average damage outcomes between these three data sets, I got 2,600 for just base, 3,091 for with vulnerable, and only 3,180 for prey on the week. And if we were to look at the damage differences here, you notice that with vulnerable, I saw a 16% damage increase. So not quite the 1.2, but close enough. And then the difference between with and without prey on the week was a whopping 2.8% damage increase. Okay, well that's the average. Let's make sure that like our median makes sense. Let's make sure our min and our max makes sense here. So for min damages, I got 2,100 for base damage, 2,504 for with vulnerable, and then 2,530 with prey on the week. The difference here again is a little bit higher than a 16% damage increase, and then only a 1.04% damage increase. Okay, no, that's fine. Well, let's look at the max damage. Clearly, it would have a significantly larger max damage value. So max damage of 3,000 with base, basically 3,700 with vulnerable, and then only 3,772 with prey in the week. Again, seeing a 20% damage increase. So finally here in the max damage, the noise has been alleviated, but only at 2.2% damage increase with prey on the week. So if I were to take my median, it looks like all of my numbers are completely within range of what the median expectation is, except the median expectation, 2.8% damage increase. 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 2.8 or with Prey on the Weak and without Prey on the Weak, but just vulnerable, are effectively the same number. They're like within like 2%. They're within like 1%, even less than 1% of a difference here. So again, I'm only seeing about a 2% damage increase. So 2% damage increase, very similar to what other people are seeing. The reason why people are expecting this to be an additive damage bonus, for whatever reason, using Decompose showed the flaw in my methodology. It showed the issue that I was running into. That's when I started noticing pretty weird behaviors. The first thing that I noticed is that at one point while I was going to check out how much additive damage I had, my vulnerable damage value on my stat sheet here was significantly higher than it should be. But it was very weird because when I came out to here, my damage value was something like 70 or 80, which is impossible. I don't have any additive damage on my character. None of the things that I have equipped have additive vulnerable damage on them. This doesn't, none of this does. So that was weird. I noticed something else that was even weirder though. And it was sometimes while getting my data, I was getting damage values that were outside of the 50% difference between min and max here. And that's impossible. And I don't mean like, oh, it should never happen or it's statistically improbable or like noise could cause this. It's literally impossible. There isn't additional variance outside of the weapons variance. There's no other way to get a variance outside of the weapon damage variance. So something wasn't quite working. So I went even further. I said, you know what? I'm going to test it again. And here's the issue with testing it again. And in fact, if you haven't seen it recently, I follow a Slay the Spire streamer by the name of Jorbs. But when you're doing statistical analysis, seeking to find your bias in your data will typically cause you to, even unintentionally, obfuscate, misinterpret, or eliminate data sets that don't fit into your narrative. Luckily, as long as I just recorded every single number that I saw, I couldn't screw this one up. It couldn't just be a bias. While I've since deleted the data set, I'll go ahead and let you in on a secret. I have a third data set and everything's about to get flipped on its head. I got the exact same results. I did another set of 50 across all three of these. I actually ended up doing 51. That's why there's an additional value here. I didn't want to arbitrarily remove one of the data set, like one of the points of data in the set, right? So I just included it here. That's why there's a random additional one. But it came to the same finding. So I went even further. I think there's something busted about the training dummies. Now, we already know that when they were first released, they weren't working quite as intended, but I noticed some other weird stuff. Like, have you ever swapped out the dummies multiple times and then went and attacked them? You just get double damage values every single time you do damage. It's hard to replicate, but if you were to sit here swapping out dummies for long enough and then go do some damage, you'll just see double numbers. Something quite ain't right with the training dummies here, so I went even further. I would change a variable, so I would either add vulnerable or remove the vulnerable, and I would leave, and I would reset the dungeon, and then I would go back in. Because one of the things that's been kind of nagging at me the entire time is that it seems to have something to do with whether or not the game is loading, that Prey on the Weak is even active on your character. Because back when I was doing the Bone Splinters testing, well, I didn't think much of it at the time. I just assumed I had screwed something up. I also got a data set where the damage just didn't increase. And then I went back into here and I went, well, hold on. Like, when's the last time I reset these things? Maybe it's because I swapped out my gear, or maybe because I swapped out these. Let me reapply them. I went back in and I got the data set that I showed you previously, and I went, oh, okay, and I didn't think much of it. But we've kind of been talking about whether or not it comes down to when you load the vampiric powers, or maybe it comes down to how the vampiric powers are applied. So let me go ahead and show you the data sets, including when I applied vulnerable via Metamorphosis as opposed to corpse tendrils. Now here you'll see I was a little bit lazy. I only did 20 attacks. Why is that? Because I'd already done 3 sets of 150 Decompose channels over the past couple hours. And if you've been following along the other videos that I've released in the past 24 hours, I haven't gone to sleep yet. So sue me, what can you do? But very, very interesting results here. So let's go ahead and check down bottom, and I promise I won't bloviate too much. The long and short of it is our base damage versus our damage with vulnerable versus our damage with just applying vulnerable from corpse tendrils and having Prey on the Weak saw the exact same things, somewhere between a 15% to a 20% damage increase, and then only a 1% and even sometimes losing out on a percentage damage increase. Now, down here I actually ended up getting like a 4.8% damage increase, so that's like kind of interesting. But what it shows is that it ain't working right. It's not working. It's not applying the damage bonus. That's insane. That's wild. How is that possible? The thing that I just ignored is the additional set of data. When I applied Vulnerable via Metamorphosis as opposed to Corpse Tendrils, after reloading the dummy, after making sure that my vampiric powers were already equipped before I walked into the training dummy, and that number showed a 10% damage increase over the average. It showed a 10% damage increase over the minimum. It only showed a 5% damage increase over the maximum from a low value of N. When you look at the median damage, so the middle value amongst all the values that we get in our data set, you'll see that we got a 14% damage increase with Prey on the Weak being applied via vulnerable status from Metamorphosis. Even if this number was truly only 5%, 16% additive damage with my character's current stats in no way, shape, or form represents a 5% total damage bonus against my damage. It just doesn't. This damage bonus right here against the median, and if we were to again look at like the average versus the median, you'll see that our average is slightly lower than the median for this data set. So if I were to continue to add data to this set, that number would get closer and closer and closer, meaning that this number would go up, this number would go up, this number would go up, and ultimately this number should also average out at the 16% damage increase. Prayer on the Weak works. Either the dummies are super broken, and for whatever reason they're not like properly reading their applied states, and it's only by applying a constant check of the accursed state, the vampiric cursed state, which then reads your vampiric powers. Maybe that's just required to get the Prayer on the Weak bonus up. There's a problem, other people have tested that, and it didn't show the same results for them either. They've used Accursed Touch, they've used Metamorphosis. But at the very least, I can show you two data sets, which you can go replicate yourselves following the steps that I detailed here. You can go see the damage increase with Bone Splinters. I don't know what you gotta do to make it actually like read the loaded state of the vampire power, but you see a lot more than just an additive 16 damage bonus here. And if you go put on Metamorphosis and Prayer on the Weak and reset the dungeon and walk into a base dummy, and then you apply Vulnerable by evading through the target, and then you check your damage bonuses versus your base damage bonus, what you should get at the end of it is equal to this divided by this, which ends up being a roughly expected 30% damage increase. It's actually a little bit more than that. Again, these numbers are slightly lower than they should be. You need a bigger sample size to see them appropriately like play out here. But it works. Now here's the problem. Can't tell you whether or not it's working out in the wild. I'm willing to go do these tests again with our good old-fashioned bear that's slightly northeast of Kiovashad, because I think it's the damage dummies. I think there's something up with them. I think they're borked. I think it's not properly reading the states. My biggest fear is that it's actually similar to Diablo 2. So if you're a veteran from Diablo 2, you may know the fact that when you first create a rune word and you put it onto your mercenary and then you load into your next game, for whatever reason, not all of the auras are loaded properly. You may also notice that like the auras don't load until they're within combat for a certain amount of time, and you have to like unequip the weapon and re-equip the weapon to see all the auras in action. I think there may be a gear-based state that is loading the items that you have, then loading the vampire packs on the armor. And then because initially there are no packs, the powers are not activated. But then when finally finish loading the total count, maybe then they're activated. And this depends on whether or not you go through like a loading screen of like transferring between one place and another place. So doing these in real time and like individually removing them and putting them back on is the thing that's causing the inconsistencies. It's really, really hard to say. If somebody else can't come out with a more conclusive set of data to pinpoint exactly what's happening, I'm willing to go outside and go test it against a bear. It's just like harder to do that and it takes longer. And I don't currently have the brain juice to be able to make that happen for you. But I wanted to put out this like unnecessarily long video talking about mostly some of the issues that were coming against needing to be able to test things in this game. If you've watched my other videos, testing in this game is incredibly challenging, and I was hoping that with the addition of the test dummies, I would finally have a very sterile place to be able to actually look at the effects of changing things in game and what their expected outcomes are. And we're not quite there yet. I would beseech the developers, take another pass at the test dummies, make sure that everything is working in the exact way that it should, and maybe even use the test dummies themselves to be able to test things like this very interaction. Is there just some problem with how the vampire powers load? I think almost certainly. It's just hard to pinpoint it down because I don't have a debug screen open. I don't have a DPS meter open. I can't read what effects are applied to the target. So if we could buff out the functionality of this testing room, even if we don't end up with a PTR, the player base can go do so much of this grunt work for everybody to be like, hey, checking the data sheet, I noticed that Prey on the Weak procced, but the secondary effect didn't proc or whatever. So the damage numbers that I'm getting don't match what they should be in game. Look at that, bada bing, bada boom. I have like the most valuable forum post to go make or bug report to submit. I would love to see this functionality to be increased even further. I would love to hear from you. Have you been testing this? What have your findings been? Have you been able to replicate the weird inconsistencies in application that I was able to see here? What testing methodologies were you using? And did you actually do the math to see whether or not the data that you were getting was valuable enough to be able to come to a conclusion? I'd love to hear from you down in the comments. I know this one is like pretty in-depth. I apologize, but it's just like, this is how hard it is to test stuff in the game. So if you walk away with nothing else, at least know that sometimes it's working and we need to come to a better understanding of exactly how it's working. If you haven't already, go ahead and subscribe to the channel. I'm trying to bring like this level of detail to every single thing that I put into the game and out into the ecosystem. I hope that helps the community, at the very least, even just think a bit more critically about how you're building your characters, how you're playing the game, and how these things are overlapping and working, how the different systems work together. And go ahead and throw a like on the video as well. That just helps YouTube know that there are nerds out there that appreciate this level of detail, and for other people who want to see it, be able to very quickly find it. But as always, thank you so much for watching this video. I truly hope that it helps, and I look forward to seeing you in the next one.